The dust hadn't settled on the road leading to Samuel Crane's ranch in over 3 weeks. Nobody came out this far unless they were lost, and even then they turned around long before they reached the crooked wooden gate with the faded name burned into it. That was exactly how Samuel preferred it. 15 years of solitude had turned him into something more landscape than man, weathered and quiet, blending into the brown hills of eastern Montana like another fence post. He was 47 years old, and the last woman who had touched him was his wife, Eleanor, who had died in the winter of 1887 from pneumonia that swept through the territory like a cruel wind. He had held her hand as she shivered beneath 3 quilts, and when her fingers went still, something inside him locked shut like a barn door rusted on its hinges. He buried her on the hill behind the house where the wildflowers grew in spring, and he never spoke of her again, not to the supply clerk in town, not to his horses, not even to himself in the long hours before sleep. The years passed with the rhythm of hard work. He raised cattle, mended fences, grew what the stubborn soil would allow, and spoke only when necessary during his monthly trip to Ridgewater for supplies. People in town called him the ghost rancher, and children whispered that he had gone mad from loneliness. He hadn't gone mad. He had simply stopped seeing the point in pretending the world owed him anything more than silence. So when the knock came on his door that October morning in 1902, he stood frozen at his kitchen table with a cup of black coffee halfway to his lips. He couldn't remember the last time someone had knocked. He set the cup down slowly, wiped his hands on his trousers, and opened the door. A woman stood on his porch. She was perhaps 30, with dark hair pinned loosely beneath a hat that had seen better days. She wore a traveling dress coated in dust, and beside her sat a single carpetbag. Her eyes were large and brown, and carried a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from one hard day, but from many hard years stacked together. She held a letter in her gloved hand. "Mr. Samuel Crane?" she asked. "Crane," he corrected, his voice rough from disuse. "I'm Clara Marsh. I've come from Pennsylvania. I'm your bride." Samuel stared at her for a long time. The wind moved across the porch and lifted the edge of her skirt. A horse tied to his gatepost stamped its hoof impatiently. "I didn't send for a bride." Clara's face changed. The cautious hope that had been holding her upright seemed to drain from her body like water from a cracked bowl. She looked down at the letter and then back at him. "This letter says Samuel Crane, rural route outside Ridgewater, Montana Territory. It says you're seeking a wife of good character and willing disposition. It says you have a working ranch and a house with 4 rooms. My name is Crane, not Crane, and I didn't write any letter." Clara pressed her lips together and looked past him into the dim interior of his house. She seemed to be calculating something, measuring the distance between where she stood and every other place in the world she might go. "I spent everything I had to get here, every cent." Samuel should have closed the door. He knew that. He should have directed her back to town and let the problem solve itself the way problems always did when you refused to get involved. But something in her voice, some particular note of dignity fighting against desperation, made him hesitate. He recognized that sound. He had heard it in his own voice 15 years ago, standing over a fresh grave with no one to hear him. "You can stay the night. I'll sleep in the barn. Tomorrow I'll take you to town and we'll sort this out." Clara nodded and picked up her carpetbag. When she stepped past him into the house, her shoulder brushed against his arm, and the contact startled him so deeply that he stepped back as though burned. She noticed, but said nothing. That evening, Samuel cooked a meal of beef and potatoes, the same meal he cooked every night, but he found himself embarrassed by it. He set the food on the table and watched Clara eat with the careful restraint of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days, but refused to let it show. They ate in silence, and when she finished, she folded her napkin and looked at him directly. "I was a school teacher in Scranton. When the school closed, I had nothing.
No family left. I answered the advertisement because I thought it was honest. I thought someone out here wanted a partner, not just a pretty face. I'm not a pretty face. I'm a hard worker." "I can see that," Samuel said, surprising himself. He went to the barn and lay in the hay with his coat pulled around him, staring at the dark rafters above. He thought about Eleanor for the first time in years, not with the sharp pain that had once accompanied her memory, but with something softer and stranger. He thought about how Eleanor used to say that loneliness was just love with nowhere to go. In the morning, he hitched the wagon, and they rode to Ridgewater in silence. At the post office, old Tom Beckley scratched his head and admitted that yes, there had been a Samuel Crane who lived 30 miles north, a widower who had placed a matrimonial advertisement in an eastern newspaper. But that Samuel Crane had died 2 months prior, thrown from his horse. The letter had already been sent. The bride had already been on her way. Clara stood in the post office with her carpetbag at her feet and received this news the way a person receives a blow they have been expecting. She thanked Mr. Beckley politely and walked outside into the cold sunlight. Samuel followed her. He found her standing beside the wagon, looking at the street as though it were an ocean she could not cross. He stood beside her, and for a long time neither of them spoke. "I have no money to go back, and nothing to go back to." "I know," he said. "I won't ask for charity. If there's work in this town, I'll find it." Samuel looked at her. He looked at the hard set of her jaw and the way her hands gripped the handle of her carpetbag as though it were the last solid thing in the world. He thought about his empty house, the 4 rooms that echoed with nothing, the tables set for one, the silence that had become so familiar he had mistaken it for peace. "The ranch is more work than one person can handle, has been for years. I could use help." Clara turned to look at him. "I won't be anyone's charity case." "It isn't charity, it's employment. Room and board and fair wages. You'd have your own room. I'd expect honest work and nothing else." She studied him for a long moment, reading something in his face that he didn't know was written there. Then she nodded. The first weeks were awkward, filled with the clumsy negotiations of 2 people who had forgotten how to share space with another human being. Samuel showed her the work, and she learned quickly, feeding the animals, mending what needed mending, keeping the house in a way it hadn't been kept in 15 years. She scrubbed the floors and washed the curtains and planted herbs near the kitchen door. Slowly, the house began to smell of something other than dust and solitude. They talked in small portions at first, exchanging only what was necessary. But as the weeks turned into months, the conversations grew longer. Samuel told her about her students in Scranton, about the books she loved, about her mother who had died when she was young. Samuel, to his own astonishment, began to talk about Eleanor. He told her about the way Eleanor laughed, about the garden she had planted that still grew wild on the hillside, about the night she died, and the silence that followed. Clara listened without pity, which was the only way he could have borne it. One evening in December, a blizzard came down from the mountains with sudden fury. The wind screamed against the walls, and the temperature dropped so fast that Samuel brought the horses into the barn and stacked wood against the door. They sat by the fire, and Clara read aloud from a book of poetry she had carried in her carpetbag all the way from Pennsylvania. Her voice was steady and warm, and Samuel closed his eyes and felt something inside him, that rusted barn door, begin to move. When she finished reading, she closed the book and looked at him. He looked back at her. The fire crackled between them. "I'm glad the letter was wrong," Samuel said. Clara smiled, and it was the kind of smile that arrives after a long winter, not bright or sudden, but deep and certain, like the first sign of thaw. She reached across the space between them and placed her hand over his. He did not pull away. Her hand was warm and rough from work, and it rested on his with a gentleness that 15 years of silence had not prepared him for. He turned his palm upward and closed his fingers around hers. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the fire burned low, and two people who had arrived at each other by mistake sat together in the quiet knowledge that some mistakes are the truest things that ever happen.